"Grace, don't touch the turkey. Just keep the kitchen clean." That's what my mother-in-law said while everyone else sat down to eat. Why was I always the one standing? Why did my husband look away like this was normal? And why did my phone keep vibrating in my pocket like it knew something I didn't? I stepped into the pantry and answered. Grace Michael said low and urgent. "A property deed was filed this afternoon. Your name is on it. Do not sign anything they give you tonight. I'm on my way." My chest tightened. I opened the document he sent. The address was the Whitman Lake House. The transfer date was today, and the name listed as the original owner wasn't anyone in that dining room. "If you're watching this, tell me where you are and what time it is for you right now. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't belong in your own family, you'll understand why I stayed quiet until I couldn't anymore." I didn't always notice when things started shifting. That's the part that still bothers me, how quietly it all happened. When I first met Daniel Whitman, he was easy to talk to. He had that kind of calm confidence that made you feel like nothing in his world was complicated. He worked in corporate finance, had a steady routine, and spoke about his family with a kind of careful pride. Not warm exactly, but respectful. I took that as a good sign. We met at a client mixer in Manhattan. I was already a few years into my career as a commercial real estate attorney, handling mid-sized acquisitions and lease negotiations. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, structured, and something I had worked hard for. I didn't talk much about it outside of work. Not because I was hiding anything, I just didn't need my job to define how people treated me. Looking back, that choice gave his family the perfect opening. The first time I went to the Whitman house in Connecticut, everything felt formal. Not cold, just controlled. Eleanor Whitman greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Charles shook my hand like he was assessing me for a position. Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. Dinner was quiet. Questions came in measured tones where I grew up, what my parents did, how Daniel and I met. No one asked about my work in detail. When I mentioned I was in real estate, Eleanor nodded and said, "Oh," administrative side. I didn't correct her. That moment set a pattern I didn't challenge soon enough. Over time, I noticed how roles were assigned in that house. Eleanor directed everything from where people sat to how dishes were served. Charles rarely contradicted her. Vanessa floated between sarcasm and indifference. And Daniel adapted. He learned to keep things smooth, to avoid tension. At first I thought helping out was just part of being welcomed into a family. When Eleanor asked if I could bring dessert one weekend, I did. Then she asked if I could come early to help set the table, then to help cook, then to just handle the kitchen since you're already in there. It never came as a demand. It was always framed as appreciation. "You're so organized, Grace. You're just better at this than the rest of us. It makes things easier for everyone." And Daniel would add quietly, "It means a lot to my mom." That last sentence carried more weight than anything Eleanor said. By our second year of marriage, it wasn't a question anymore. Every holiday, every gathering, I was the one coordinating food, managing, timing, cleaning up. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that families have dynamics, that I was choosing peace over confrontation. But peace, I learned, has a cost when it only goes one way. The first time I really questioned it was at a summer dinner about a year ago. The conversation shifted to the lake house. It came up casually, Vanessa complaining about having to drive up there the following weekend. Eleanor corrected her tone immediately. "That house has been in this family for generations. You don't speak about it like it's an inconvenience." Charles said nothing. Daniel changed the subject. I remember asking lightly, "I've never seen it. Is it far?" Eleanor smiled, but it felt rehearsed. "It's just a family place. Nothing you need to worry about." Nothing you need to worry about. That phrasing stayed with me longer than it should have. After that, I started noticing small things, how conversations about the house stopped when I entered the room, how Charles would close folders or flip papers face down if I walked into his study, how Daniel avoided eye contact if I asked even basic questions about it. None of it was dramatic. No arguments. No obvious secrets. Just absence. Carefully maintained. The moment that shifted everything came 2 months before Thanksgiving. I was upstairs carrying a tray of coffee. Eleanor had guests over, and I'd been in the kitchen for most of the afternoon. As I approached Charles's study, the door was slightly open. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard my name. "She doesn't need to know," Charles said, his voice low but firm. Eleanor responded immediately. "Of course she doesn't. The less she understands, the easier this is." There was a pause. Papers rustled. Then Charles added, quieter this time, "As long as the transfer goes through before year-end, it won't matter anyway." I stood there longer than I should have, the tray growing heavier in my hands. Transfer. That word landed differently for me than it would for anyone else in that house. I went back to the kitchen without saying anything, finished pouring coffee, smiled when Eleanor introduced me to her guests as Daniel's wife, cleaned up after everyone left. But something had shifted. That night when Daniel and I got home, I asked him directly, "What were your parents talking about this afternoon?" He didn't even hesitate. "Probably business stuff." "You know how my dad is. Something about a transfer," I said. Daniel exhaled like I was making things complicated. "Grace, not everything is a big deal. It's just property management." "Just property management?" I nodded, let it go. But I didn't forget. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done before. I looked it up. Public property records are by design accessible. Most people never think to check them, but I work with them every day. I know where inconsistencies hide. I know what's supposed to be there and what isn't. The lake house wasn't hard to find. What surprised me wasn't that it existed. It was how many times it had changed hands within the same family, and how one transfer about 6 years ago didn't have a complete record. There was a reference to an attached document, something that should have outlined conditions or restrictions. But the attachment itself wasn't there. It was marked as filed, just not available. I stared at the screen longer than I expected. Because in my line of work, documents don't just disappear. They get misplaced, misfiled, or intentionally separated. I closed the laptop and sat there thinking about everything I'd chosen not to question, about the way Eleanor spoke to me, about the way Daniel avoided conflict, about the house no one wanted me to understand. That afternoon, I reached out to someone I trusted, Michael Reeves. We'd worked together early in my career before he moved into private practice, focusing on property disputes. He was precise, careful, and more importantly, he didn't jump to conclusions. I sent him the file reference and a simple message. "Can you check if this attachment exists somewhere else?" He replied an hour later. "Maybe. Give me a day." I told myself that was enough, that I was overthinking things, that there would be a simple explanation. But the next day, my phone rang before noon. Michael didn't waste time with small talk. "Grace," he said, "the document wasn't lost." I sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "It was filed," he said. "Just not where it was supposed to be." A pause. Then he added more quietly, "And that's not an accident." I didn't respond right away, because in that moment something I hadn't wanted to admit became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about how they treated me. This was about something they were trying to keep me from seeing. Michael continued, "I need to pull the full archive. It might take a few days." Okay, I said. Grace, he added, whatever you do, don't confront them yet. I almost laughed at that. Confrontation had never been the problem. Silence had. I hung up and sat there, the weight of it settling in slowly. For the first time since I married into that family, I wasn't trying to make things easier. I was trying to understand what was actually happening. And that changed everything. That evening when I walked into the Whitman house for dinner, Eleanor greeted me the same way she always did. Polite. Controlled. Grace, can you take care of the kitchen tonight? I looked at her for a second longer than usual, then I nodded. Because now I wasn't just helping, I was watching. Once you start looking at something through a professional lens, it's hard to turn it off. For years, I had separated my work from my personal life on purpose. It kept things simple. It kept people from making assumptions about me. But now that distance felt like a mistake I couldn't afford anymore. I went back to the lake house records the next morning. Not casually this time. Methodically. Property records tell a story if you know how to read them. Every transfer, every lien, every amendment, it's all part of a chain. And when something doesn't line up, it usually means someone didn't want it to. The Whitman Lake House had been in the family for decades. That part was true. But the ownership trail wasn't as straightforward as they made it sound. 6 years ago, the property had been transferred from Daniel's grandmother, Margaret Whitman, to a holding structure that listed Charles as managing party. That wasn't unusual by itself. Families do that for tax planning or estate management. What was unusual was the missing attachment tied to that transfer. The system showed it had been filed, but the actual document wasn't accessible, which meant one of two things: it had been misfiled, or it had been intentionally separated from the main record. I zoomed in on the metadata, checking timestamps, clerk notes, cross-references. There was a flag small, easy to overlook, filed under supplemental archive. I leaned back in my chair. That wasn't standard. Supplemental archives are where documents go when they don't fit neatly into a public-facing record. Sometimes for privacy, sometimes for legal sensitivity, sometimes to avoid attention. I called Michael. You see the supplemental flag? I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Then I was hoping you hadn't noticed that yet. Why? Because it means we're not just dealing with a missing document, he said. We're dealing with one that was intentionally moved. My stomach tightened. Can we access it? Not through the normal portal, he said. But I can request it through the county archive. It'll take a few days. A few days, I repeated. That's assuming no one pushes back, he added. If someone flagged it for restricted handling, it could get complicated. Complicated. That word carried a different weight now. Do it, I said. Grace. Michael said, his tone shifting slightly before I file anything formal. I need to ask you something. I already knew what it was. Do you trust your husband in this? I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer wasn't simple. I don't know, I said finally. Michael didn't push. Okay, then don't loop him in yet. I wasn't planning to. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at the screen. 6 years ago. That was before Daniel and I were married, before I had even met his family, which meant whatever that missing document was, it wasn't created with me in mind. So why hide it from me now? I closed my laptop and tried to focus on work, but my mind kept circling back to the same question. What exactly were they protecting? That night I decided to try something I hadn't done before. I brought it up directly, not the document, not the investigation, just the house. Daniel was in the living room going through emails on his tablet. I sat across from him watching him for a second before speaking. "Can I ask you something about the lake house?" His fingers paused for just a moment before he looked up. "Sure," he said. "Too quickly." "Why have I never been there?" I asked. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's just not really used that much." "That's not what your mom says," I replied. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. "She exaggerates. You know how she is." I held his gaze. "Who owns it?" There it was, a simple question, one that should have had a simple answer. Daniel looked at me for a long second. Then he exhaled and leaned back. "It's a family asset, Grace. It's not like one person owns it outright." "That's not how property works," I said before I could stop myself. His expression tightened. "Not everything has to be a legal analysis," he said. That stung more than I expected. "Then just explain it to me without one," I said, keeping my voice even. He looked away. And that was the moment I knew, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Daniel wasn't confused. He wasn't unsure. He was choosing not to answer. "I don't think this is something we need to get into right now," he said finally. I nodded slowly. "Okay." And I let it go. At least that's what it looked like. 2 days later, Michael called again. "I found it," he said. I stood up without realizing it. The supplemental document. "Yeah." It took some convincing, but I got a copy. My heart was already racing. "What is it? What is it?" There was a pause. "Grace, it's not just a standard attachment." "What do you mean?" "It's a conditional transfer agreement," he said, "with restrictions." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Restrictions on what on sale on transfer and on who has authority over the property. I swallowed. "Okay. And there's something else," he added. Of course there was. "There's a named party in the condition clause." I closed my eyes for a second. Who Michael didn't answer right away. "Grace," he said finally, "I need you to see this in person." "That bad? That specific?" I let out a slow breath. "When can you come by?" I asked. "I can meet you tomorrow morning," he said. "My office." "Okay." We hung up and I stood there for a moment, the quiet in my apartment feeling heavier than usual. A conditional transfer agreement, a named party, and a family that had spent years making sure I stayed just far enough away from the truth. The next morning, I walked into Michael's office with a kind of focus I hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't waste time. He handed me a printed copy of the document. "Start here," he said, pointing to the second page. I scanned the first few lines quickly, legal language standard clauses, nothing unexpected. Then my eyes landed on the condition section, and I froze. Because there, in clear, unambiguous text, was my name. Not as a witness, not as a third party, but as a protected interest holder. I read it again slower this time, then a third time. It didn't make sense. This document was dated 6 years ago, before I had even met Daniel, before I had any connection to the Whitman family at all. I looked up at Michael. "This has to be a mistake," I said. He shook his head. "It's not," he said. "And that's the problem." I stared back down at the page, my thoughts racing. If this wasn't a mistake, then it meant one thing. Somehow I had been written into a legal agreement before I ever became part of that family, and no one had ever told me. I didn't take the document home with me right away. I sat in Michael's office longer than I expected, reading the same paragraph over and over like it might change if I gave it enough time. It didn't. The language was precise, intentional. The lake house legally described in full detail could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the consent of a named protected interest holder. Grace Ramirez. My name. 6 years ago. Walk me through this, I said quietly. Michael leaned back slightly, giving me space to process, but not stepping away from the facts. Margaret Whitman, he said, your husband's grandmother. She created this agreement shortly before she passed. I never met her, I said. I know, he replied. But she knew about you. That didn't make sense. How Michael slid another document across the table. Not a legal filing, more like a personal note, typed and signed. I found this attached to the archive file, he said. It wasn't meant for public record. I hesitated before picking it up. The note was short, direct, written in a tone that felt certain. She wrote about Daniel, about the kind of man he was, kind but easily influenced, about Eleanor's need for control, about Charles's tendency to avoid conflict. And then she wrote about me, not by name at first. She described the woman he will choose if he is allowed to choose freely, someone independent, someone who wouldn't be impressed by money, someone who would care more about stability than status. My chest tightened as I kept reading. She will be the only one who understands what this house should not become. The next line had my full name, Grace Ramirez, printed clearly like it had always belonged there. I don't understand, I said, lowering the paper. How could she know me? Michael didn't answer immediately. Grace, he said finally. Sometimes these agreements are prepared in advance, based on information families already have. Information. That word lingered. What kind of information, I asked. He met my eyes. Your firm represented a transaction connected to the Whitman family about 8 years ago. I blinked. I was still an associate. I know, but your name would have been on internal reports. Due diligence notes, possibly flagged. I sat back slowly. So she hadn't known me personally. She had known of me, seen my work, my decisions, my patterns, and made a judgment. I started, then stopped. It wasn't flattering. It wasn't comforting. It was calculated. She chose you as a safeguard, Michael said. Someone outside the immediate family. Someone unlikely to be influenced by internal pressure. I let out a quiet breath, and no one told me I said, no, he replied. And based on what I'm seeing, that wasn't an oversight. Of course it wasn't. If I had known, everything would have been different. I would have asked questions. I would have looked at documents. I would have had a reason to. Instead, I had spent years trying to fit into a role that was designed to keep me uninformed. I stood up and walked to the window, needing a second to think without looking at the paperwork. Okay, I said finally. So what were they trying to do yesterday? Michael didn't hesitate. The documents your father-in-law handed you, he said. Those weren't insurance updates. I figured. They were structured to look like routine maintenance filings, he continued. But buried in the language was a consent clause. I turned back to him. A consent clause for what? For a partial transfer, he said. If you had signed it, you would have effectively waived your right to block future transactions. It took a second for that to land. They were trying to get around the restriction, I said. Yes, and they needed my signature to do it cleanly. Yes. I felt something shift inside me, not panic, not anger exactly. Clarity. For years I had been trying to understand their behavior in emotional terms, family dynamics, expectations, miscommunication. But this wasn't emotional. It was strategic. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had planned around me. I walked back to the table and picked up the agreement again. Why now, I asked. Why push it this Thanksgiving? Michael considered that. Timing, he said. End of fiscal year. Market conditions. Maybe they thought you'd be distracted. Or pressured. Or compliant, I said. He didn't argue with that. I sat down again, calmer now than I expected. So what happens next? I asked. That depends on what you want, he said. Legally, you're in a strong position. They can't move forward without you. And now that we have the full documentation, any attempt to bypass that could create liability. Liability for who? For anyone who knowingly participated, he said, including your husband if he was aware. I nodded slowly. That was the part I hadn't fully processed yet. Daniel. What do you think he knew? I asked. Michael didn't answer right away. I think he said carefully he knew enough to stay quiet. That felt accurate. Not active deception, but not innocence either. Silence as participation. I looked down at my phone still on the table. No messages from Daniel. No missed calls. Just quiet. Okay, I said more to myself than to Michael. I'm not signing anything. Good, he said. And I'm not confronting them yet, I added. He gave a small nod. Also good. I picked up my bag, but I didn't move toward the door right away. There's one more thing, Michael said. I paused. The agreement doesn't just restrict transfers, he said. It also outlines an alternative. I turned back. What kind of alternative? If the protected interest holder determines the property is being misused or leveraged in a way that contradicts the original intent, he said they can initiate a restructuring. Restructuring how? By moving the property into a trust, he said, with conditions that remove direct control from the current managing parties. I stared at him. You mean I could take it out of their hands completely? If you can demonstrate intent, he said. Yes. That wasn't something I had expected. Not leverage, authority. I let that settle for a second. Okay, I said quietly, because now the situation wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about deciding what to do with that power. I left Michael's office with the documents in my bag and a kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. Not reactive, not emotional, intentional. When I got home that evening, Daniel was already there. He looked up when I walked in like he had been waiting. Hey, he said. Where were you? I set my bag down slowly. Out, I said. He studied me for a second. Then he asked carefully, Is everything okay? I met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to make the answer easier. I'm not sure yet, I said. He nodded like that was enough, like not knowing was still part of the same version of me he was used to. But it wasn't, because now I knew something he didn't. Something his entire family had worked to keep from me, and I hadn't decided what to do with it yet. Thanksgiving Day started before sunrise for me. By 6 a.m., I was already in Eleanor Whitman's kitchen tying my hair back, scanning the handwritten list she'd left on the counter like it was a set of instructions instead of a request. Turkey prep, 2 sides from scratch, 3 desserts, table settings for 14. No one else was awake. Or at least, no one else was expected to be. I moved through it quietly the way I always had. Measuring, timing, adjusting oven temperatures. Years of hosting for clients had taught me how to run a kitchen efficiently, but this wasn't that. There was no appreciation here. No acknowledgement of effort. Just expectation. Around 9 a.m., Eleanor came in already dressed, already composed. She glanced at the counter, then at me. "You're a little behind on the sides," she said. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. "Vanessa doesn't like them overcooked." "I've accounted for that," I replied. She nodded once as if she were confirming something she already believed. "Good. It reflects on all of us. On all of us." I almost said something, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back to the stove and let the silence settle again. By noon, the house was full. Voices carried from the living room, laughter, overlapping conversations, glasses clinking. Charles was telling a story. Vanessa chimed in with commentary. Daniel moved between rooms greeting people, staying just busy enough to avoid being pinned down anywhere. No one came into the kitchen, except to take something. At one point, Vanessa leaned against the doorway, watching me plate the appetizers. "You really go all out," she said. "I mean, if we ever needed a backup career for you, this is solid." I looked at her. She smiled like it was a compliment. I didn't respond. She shrugged and walked away. That was the rhythm of it. Small comments framed as harmless, each one easy to dismiss on its own. But together they built something harder to ignore. By the time we sat down to eat, everything was in place. The table was set exactly the way Eleanor liked it. Food arranged symmetrically, serving order pre-planned, timing aligned. I took my seat last. Eleanor stood lifting her glass slightly. "I just want to say how proud I am of this family," she began. "The traditions we've kept, the standards we've maintained." Her eyes moved around the table, landing briefly on each person, then finally on me. "And Grace," she added, "has been very helpful this year." Helpful, not daughter-in-law, not part of the family. Helpful. A few people nodded politely. Someone murmured agreement. I picked up my fork. Halfway through the meal, Charles cleared his throat. "I need a quick moment before dessert," he said. The room quieted. He reached into a folder beside his chair and pulled out a small stack of papers. Clean, organized, prepared. "Just some routine updates," he continued. "Insurance adjustments. Nothing complicated." He turned toward me. "Grace, since you handle paperwork so well," he said, "I figured you could take a look and sign where needed. No rush, just before the end of the weekend." The room felt still in a different way now. Not silent. Watchful. I took the papers from him. The formatting was clean, professional, structured to look familiar enough not to raise concern, but I didn't read like most people. I scanned. Section headers first, then clause placement, then language that didn't belong. It didn't take long. There it was, buried under 2 layers of standard phrasing, an authorization clause tied to property adjustments. Not insurance, transfer adjacent. Subtle, but not invisible. I looked up. Charles was watching me. Eleanor, too. Daniel avoided my eyes. Of course he did. I set the papers down in front of me, aligning them carefully. "I'm not signing this," I said. No raised voice. No hesitation. Just a statement. Eleanor blinked once like she hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not signing it," I repeated. "It's not an insurance document." A pause stretched across the table. Charles leaned forward slightly. "It's standard language," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." "I know exactly what it is," I replied. That changed the tone. Not dramatically, but enough. Eleanor set her glass down a little too precisely. "Grace," she said, her voice tightening just enough to notice this isn't the time to make things complicated. I met her gaze. "I'm not the one doing that." Vanessa let out a quiet laugh like she was trying to break the tension. "Seriously," she said, "we're doing this at Thanksgiving." I didn't respond to her. This wasn't about her. Charles exhaled slowly. "We can revisit it later," he said. "No need to make a scene." A scene. That word landed differently now, because for the first time I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. "No," I said, "we won't revisit it." Daniel finally looked at me. "Grace," he said quietly, "maybe we should just—" I turned to him. "Just what I asked." He didn't finish the sentence. Of course he didn't, because there wasn't a version of that sentence that didn't involve me stepping back. Again. I reached for my glass of water more to steady my hands than anything else. And that's when the doorbell rang. Sharp, clear, unexpected. Everyone froze for a second. Eleanor frowned. Were we expecting someone? No one answered. I stood up before anyone else could. "I'll get it," I said. The walk to the front door felt longer than it should have. Each step measured, each second stretching just enough to make the moment heavier. When I opened the door, Michael Reeves was standing there. Dark coat, briefcase in hand, expression calm but focused. "Grace," he said like we were meeting for a scheduled appointment. I stepped aside. "Come in." The room behind me shifted as he entered. Conversation stopped. Attention redirected. Michael took in the scene quickly, the table, the papers, the faces. Then he looked at Charles. "Mr. Whitman," he said politely, "I believe we need to talk about the lake house." No one spoke. Michael set his briefcase down on the nearest surface and opened it with deliberate precision. "Because a property deed was recorded this afternoon," he continued, "and I don't think everyone here understands what that means." I felt the weight of the room settle around us. Not chaos. Not yet. But something close to it. Michael reached into the case and pulled out a folder. "Before anyone signs anything else," he said, "we should probably review the actual ownership structure." He placed the folder on the table, right in front of Charles. And for the first time since I'd known them, no one in that family looked in control. No one reached for the folder. That was the first thing I noticed. For a family that moved quickly when it came to decisions, to appearances, to controlling a room, this hesitation felt unfamiliar. Michael didn't rush them. He opened the folder himself, sliding out a neatly tabbed set of documents and placing the top page where everyone could see it. "This is the recorded deed from earlier today," he said, his tone even. "Filed with the county at 2:14 p.m. Charles leaned forward, but he didn't touch it. Eleanor stayed very still. Vanessa crossed her arms. Daniel stayed where he was, halfway between standing and sitting, like he hadn't decided which version of himself to be yet. I stepped back slightly, giving Michael the space to do what he came to do. "What you're looking at," he continued, "is an attempted transfer based on a prior chain of title that includes a conditional agreement." He glanced at me briefly, then back at the table. "A conditional agreement that requires explicit consent from a protected interest holder before any material change can be executed." Silence. Then Charles spoke. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We're aware of our own documents." Michael nodded once. "I'm sure you are," he replied. "The question is whether everyone else in this room is." That landed, not loudly, but precisely. Eleanor's expression sharpened. "Grace," she said, turning toward me, "what exactly is this?" It wasn't confusion. It was calculation. I held her gaze. It's something I should have known about a long time ago. Michael flipped to the next page. This, he said, tapping lightly, is the supplemental agreement from 6 years ago, the one that wasn't included in the primary filing. Vanessa shifted. What does that even mean? It means Michael said that part of the ownership structure was intentionally kept out of the standard public record. Charles straightened slightly. For privacy, he said. For control, Michael corrected. The word hung there. Uncomfortable. Accurate, Michael continued. The agreement outlines restrictions on sale, transfer, and encumbrance of the lake house property. He paused. Specifically, it prevents any such action without the consent of the named protected interest holder. Vanessa let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. Okay. And who exactly is that supposed to be? Michael didn't answer her. He turned the document slightly so the name was clearly visible. Grace Ramirez. I didn't look at it. I already knew, but the room reacted differently. Vanessa's expression changed, first confusion, giving way to something sharper. Eleanor didn't react immediately. She just stared at the page, her face unreadable. Charles's jaw tightened. And Daniel? Daniel finally looked at me. Not quickly, not dramatically, just directly. How long have you known? He asked. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter. I met his gaze. Long enough, I said. Michael continued before the conversation could shift. This agreement was executed by Margaret Whitman prior to her passing, he said. It includes a condition designed to prevent unilateral decisions regarding the property. Eleanor's composure cracked just enough to show. That document was never meant to be interpreted like this, she said. Michael didn't argue. It's being interpreted exactly as written, he replied. Charles leaned forward again, this time placing his hand flat on the table. This is a family matter, he said. It doesn't require outside involvement. Michael's expression didn't change. With respect, he said it became a legal matter the moment a new deed was filed this afternoon. That was the shift. Not loud, not explosive, but definitive. Because now this wasn't just about control inside a room. It was about accountability outside of it. Eleanor turned to me again. Grace, she said, her voice controlled but tight. You've misunderstood something. That agreement was created under very specific circumstances. Then explain them, I said. She hesitated. Just for a second, but it was enough. Charles stepped in. It was a precaution, he said. My mother was concerned about external influences. She wanted to ensure the property stayed within the family. By excluding me from knowing about it, I asked. No, he said quickly. By protecting the structure. The wording was careful, but the meaning was clear. They hadn't protected the structure from outsiders. They had protected it from me. Or more accurately, they had protected themselves from me. Michael flipped to another section of the document. There's also a clause regarding enforcement, he said. No one responded. He continued anyway. If the protected interest holder determines that the property is being leveraged or manipulated in a way that contradicts the original intent, they have the authority to initiate corrective action. Vanessa frowned. Corrective? How Michael looked at me. I didn't say anything. Not yet. He answered for me. By restructuring ownership, he said, including transferring the property into a controlled trust. That changed the room, because now this wasn't just about stopping something. It was about what could happen next. Eleanor's eyes moved to me again. Slower this time. More deliberate. You wouldn't do that, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a test. I held her gaze. I haven't decided what I'm going to do, I said. That was the truth, but it wasn't the answer she wanted. Charles exhaled slowly. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. We were simply trying to update documentation. There was no intent to bypass anything. Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because intent in this context wasn't about what they said. It was about what they tried to do, and what they needed me to sign to do it. Daniel finally spoke again. Grace, he said, his voice quieter now. Can we talk about this? Privately? I looked at him. Really looked. For the first time that night, I wasn't seeing the version of him I had tried to protect. I was seeing the version that had stayed silent. I don't think there's anything left to keep private, I said. That landed harder than anything else I'd said. Not because it was louder, but because it closed a door he had relied on. Michael began organizing the documents again, stacking them neatly. For now, he said no further action can be taken without Grace's consent. Any attempt to proceed otherwise would create significant legal exposure. He closed the folder, which I assume everyone here would prefer to avoid. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue with. The facts were on the table, the structure was clear, and the control they had held for years was no longer theirs. I stood there for a moment taking it all in. Not the victory, because it didn't feel like that. Just the shift. The space where something had changed. Irreversibly. And then Michael said something I hadn't expected. There's one more document, he added. The room stilled again. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. This was stored with the original agreement, he said, marked for future disclosure. He looked at me. Grace, I think this is for you. I stepped forward slowly and took it from him. The paper felt heavier than it should have. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye in the room followed as I looked down at the seal, unopened, untouched, waiting. I ran my thumb along the edge, and for the first time that night, I hesitated. The envelope wasn't fragile, but it felt like it. Thick paper, clean seal. My name printed in a typeface that matched the legal documents, but this wasn't legal. Not really. I could feel everyone watching me, waiting. Not for what the letter said, but for what I would do with it. I broke the seal. The sound was quiet, but in that room it carried. Inside was a single folded page. No attachments, no legal formatting. Just a letter. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, measured. The kind of writing that didn't need to be explained because it already knew it would be understood. I read the first line. Grace Ramirez. Not to whom it may concern. Not to the family. My name. Like it had always been meant to be there. I kept reading. I don't expect to meet you, but I expect that if things go as I believe they will, you will be standing in a room where people are trying to decide what you deserve without ever asking you. My throat tightened slightly. Around me, the room stayed silent. No one interrupted. No one dared. I built what I could with the time I had, but I have watched this family long enough to understand its habits. Control disguised as protection. Silence mistaken for harmony. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who those words were about. Daniel is not a bad man, but he is not a strong one when it matters most. I felt that more than I expected, because it wasn't harsh. It was accurate, and the people around him will not change unless something forces them to. A pause. The next line felt different. more personal. If you are reading this, it means you are already part of this family in a way they may not fully accept. That is not your failure. That is their limitation. I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I was holding. For that reason, I made a decision before I lost the ability to do so. I placed a condition on the property not to give it to you, but to ensure that someone with clarity would have a say in what becomes of it, not to give it to you. That mattered. This wasn't a gift. It was a safeguard. You may never need to use it. I hope you don't. But if you do, I trust that you will not confuse access with obligation. That line stayed with me because it was something I had struggled with for years. The idea that being included meant I had to accept everything that came with it, even when it cost me. I am not asking you to protect this family. I am asking you to protect yourself from becoming what they expect you to be. I lowered the letter slightly, just for a second, because that was the first time it felt like she was speaking directly to me, not as part of a structure, not as a name in a document, as a person. I kept reading. If you choose to walk away, do it without apology. If you choose to stay, do it with boundaries they cannot ignore. A faint sound came from across the room, Vanessa shifting in her seat. No one else moved. The house is not the point. It never was. What it represents will change depending on who controls it. That more than anything clarified what this had always been about. Not property, power, influence, narrative. The final lines were shorter. Whatever you decide, make sure it is yours. No signature. Just a printed name at the bottom. Margaret Whitman. I folded the letter carefully, not because I needed to, but because I wasn't ready to let it sit open in front of them. When I looked up, the room felt different. Not quieter, just more honest. Eleanor was watching me with a kind of focus I hadn't seen before. Not dismissive, not controlling, assessing. Charles looked older, not physically, just less certain. Vanessa avoided my eyes completely, and Daniel hadn't moved, but something in his expression had shifted. Not defensiveness, not even guilt. Recognition. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. How long have you known? I asked him. The same question I had left hanging before. This time he answered. A while, he said. Not precise, not detailed, but not a denial. A while, I repeated. He nodded once. I didn't know the specifics, he added quickly, just that there were conditions. And you never thought to tell me I asked. He looked down for a second. I thought it would make things harder, he said. I let that sit, because in his mind that probably sounded reasonable. Avoid conflict, keep things smooth, maintain balance. But balance, I had learned, isn't neutral when it always leans in one direction. It already was harder, I said. He didn't argue, because he couldn't. Eleanor spoke next. Her voice was quieter than before. That letter, she said, was written at a time when my mother-in-law was not herself. It was a subtle attempt, not to deny, but to reframe. I looked at her. She seemed very clear to me, I said. Eleanor held my gaze. Then for the first time that night, she didn't push back. Charles exhaled slowly. We didn't handle this well, he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than anything else I had heard from him. We believed, he continued, that keeping the structure intact was the priority. And I wasn't part of that structure, I asked. He hesitated. Then quietly, not in the way that mattered legally. That was the truth. And somehow hearing it said out loud made everything simpler. Not easier, just clearer. Vanessa finally spoke. "So what happens now?" she asked. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't sarcastic. It was uncertain. And for once, she wasn't performing. Everyone looked at me, not because I had demanded it, but because the situation had shifted in a way none of them could ignore. I held the letter in my hand, feeling its weight again, not as pressure, as clarity. "I don't know yet," I said. And that was honest, because for the first time since I walked into that house years ago, I wasn't reacting to what they expected. I was deciding what I wanted, and I hadn't made that decision yet. A week later, the house felt like a different place. Not quieter, not calmer, just careful. Every word was measured. Every interaction paused half a second too long, like everyone was recalculating where they stood now that the ground had shifted. I didn't go back there immediately after Thanksgiving. I needed space, real space, not just distance across rooms where conversations never reached the surface. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. At first, he tried to keep things normal. Texts about groceries, casual questions about my day, small familiar routines. But normal only works when both people are still playing along. By the third day, he stopped pretending. "Can we talk?" he asked one night when I came home late. I set my keys down and nodded. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place where we'd had 100 conversations that never went deep enough. This time felt different. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. It wasn't a strong opening, but it was honest. I waited. He ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he was uncomfortable. "I knew there were conditions on the house," he continued. "I knew my grandmother had set something up before she passed, but my mom always handled the details. My dad stayed out of it. And you stayed quiet," I said. He nodded. "I thought if I didn't push it, things would just stay stable." Stable. That word again. "I thought I was protecting you from getting pulled into it," he added. I leaned back slightly. By making sure I didn't know what was happening, I asked. He didn't answer, because there wasn't a version of that logic that held up anymore. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. That was the part that made everything harder. Daniel wasn't malicious. He wasn't calculating. He was passive. And in a family like his, passivity wasn't neutral. It enabled everything. "I need you to understand something I said." He looked up. "I didn't get hurt because of one decision I continued. I got hurt because every time something mattered, you chose not to step in." He swallowed but didn't interrupt. "That's not something I can just reset," I said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was final in a way neither of us had said out loud yet. A few days later, I met Michael again. Not at his office this time. At a quiet cafe a few blocks away. I brought the documents with me. The agreement, the deed, the letter, all of it. So he said after we ordered, "Have you decided what you want to do?" I took a moment before answering. Because this wasn't just about legal options anymore. It was about direction. They were trying to push a transfer through before the end of the year, I said. If I hadn't caught it, they would have had a clean path. Michael nodded. "That's right. And now they can't move forward without me." "Correct." I looked down at the letter for a second. "She didn't give me control," I said quietly. "She gave me a checkpoint." "That's a good way to put it," he replied. I took a breath. "I don't want to fight them in court," I said. "I don't want to drag this out or turn it into something bigger than it already is." "That's understandable," Michael said. "But I also don't want to leave things the way they are," I added. He leaned back slightly. Then we're looking at restructuring, he said. I nodded. The trust option, I said. He pulled a notepad closer. If you invoke the clause, we can initiate a transfer into a controlled trust, he explained. The terms would follow the original intent restricted sale, shared oversight, no unilateral decisions. No one person in control, I said. Exactly. I thought about that. About Eleanor. About Charles. About how much of their dynamic depended on control being concentrated. And I can set the conditions I asked. With legal guidance, yes, he said. As long as they align with the original agreement. I nodded slowly. That's what I want, I said. Not revenge. Not punishment. Structure. Something that couldn't be bent based on who had the loudest voice in the room. Michael made a few notes. We'll need to document intent, he said. The email chain helps. The attempted transfer helps. The letter strengthens everything. I looked up. And Daniel, I asked. Michael paused. He's part of the current structure, he said, but not a controlling one. That sounded right. He'll be informed, Michael added, but he won't have the ability to override anything. I nodded. That was enough. A few days later, I received something I hadn't expected. An email thread. Forwarded anonymously. No message attached. Just subject lines and replies. I opened it slowly. The chain went back months. Eleanor's name appeared first. We need to move this before year-end. Then Charles. Only if we can get her to sign. Then Daniel. A short reply. She won't question it if it looks routine. I read that line twice. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. Perfectly. I closed the email, sat there for a moment, and let the last piece settle into place. Not suspicion, not doubt. Confirmation. That night I sent Michael a single message. We're moving forward. He replied almost immediately. I'll start the process. I put my phone down and looked around my apartment. For the first time in a long time, everything felt quiet. Not because something had been resolved, but because something had finally been decided. The next step wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I was willing to carry forward, and what I wasn't. 2 months later, everything looked orderly on paper. That was the part people don't see when they think about justice. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't happen in one moment. It's a series of documents, signatures, filings, each one small on its own, but together they change who has authority. Michael handled most of it, but I stayed involved in every step. Not emotionally, professionally. We documented the attempted transfer from Thanksgiving. The language in the documents Charles had handed me. The email thread I'd received. The original conditional agreement and Margaret Whitman's letter. It wasn't about proving intent in a courtroom. It was about establishing a pattern. Control exercised quietly, then pushed further when no one resisted. That pattern mattered because it justified the restructuring. The trust wasn't complicated in theory, but it was precise in execution. The lake house would no longer sit under a single managing party. It would be placed into a controlled structure with defined rules, no sale, no transfer, no leverage without collective consent and oversight. No shortcuts, no routine updates hidden inside legal language. No one person, Eleanor included, would have the ability to move anything forward alone. When the documents were ready, Michael scheduled a meeting. Neutral location. Conference room. No family dining table. No familiar dynamics to fall back on. Charles arrived first. He looked composed, but not in the way he used to. There was something more measured in his movements now, less certainty, more awareness. Eleanor came in a few minutes later. She didn't greet me. She didn't need to. Her focus was already on the documents laid out on the table. Daniel was last. He paused when he saw me like he was trying to decide what version of this conversation we were about to have. I didn't help him. Michael began without preamble. "These are the finalized restructuring documents," he said. "They reflect the conditions outlined in the original agreement with enforcement mechanisms added to prevent unilateral action." He slid copies across the table. Charles picked his up immediately. Eleanor waited half a second longer. Daniel didn't touch his right away. "This removes the property from individual control," Michael continued. "It places it into a trust structure with defined oversight and restrictions." Charles read carefully. Eleanor scanned. Daniel finally reached for his copy. "This is excessive," Eleanor said after a moment. Her tone was controlled, but tighter than usual. "It's aligned with the original agreement," Michael replied. "That agreement was never intended to limit family authority," she said. "It was intended to limit individual authority," he corrected. The distinction mattered, and she knew it. Charles spoke next. "This prevents us from making necessary decisions," he said. "It prevents you from making unilateral decisions," Michael said. "Those are not the same." Silence settled over the table again. I watched them not as family, not as people I had tried to understand, as parties in a structure. That made everything clearer. Eleanor set her copy down. "And what happens if we don't agree to this?" she asked. Michael didn't look at me when he answered. "The existing restrictions remain in place," he said, "which means no transfer, no sale, and no financial leverage tied to the property can proceed." Charles frowned slightly. "And the attempted filing from Thanksgiving?" he asked. Michael met his gaze. "That creates exposure," he said, "particularly if it's determined that there was knowledge of the conditional restriction at the time." The room shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now the options weren't abstract. They were defined. Eleanor looked at me. For the first time since all of this started, there was no performance in it. No dismissal. No control. Just calculation stripped down to its simplest form. "You're willing to do this," she said. It wasn't a question. I held her gaze. "I'm willing to make sure this doesn't happen again," I said. She studied me for a second longer. Then she nodded once. "Not agreement. Acknowledgement." Charles leaned back slightly, exhaling. "This isn't how I expected this to go," he said. I didn't respond, because expectations had never included me in the first place. Daniel finally spoke. "Grace," he said, his voice quieter now, "this doesn't have to end like this." I looked at him, not with anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. "It already did," I said. That was the part he hadn't accepted yet. That the outcome wasn't being decided in that room. It had been building for years. This was just where it became visible. Michael slid a pen across the table. "Take your time," he said. Charles picked it up first. He read through the final page again, then signed. Not reluctantly, but not easily either. Eleanor watched him. Then after a moment she reached for her own pen. She didn't look at me when she signed. She didn't need to. This wasn't about acknowledgement anymore. It was about limitation. Daniel was last. He held the pen longer than the others, like it meant something different to him. Maybe it did, because this wasn't just a legal shift for him. It was the point where his silence stopped protecting anything. He signed. Michael collected the documents, checking each one carefully. Once these are filed, he said the structure becomes effective immediately. No one responded, because there was nothing left to negotiate, no room left to reinterpret. The system had been set, not by them, by something they hadn't accounted for. I gathered my things slowly, not rushing to leave. Not staying either. As I stood, Charles spoke again. "You didn't have to go this far," he said. I paused. Then I turned back. "I didn't," I said. "But you didn't leave me another option." That was the truth. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just accurate. Eleanor didn't say anything. Daniel didn't either, and for the first time since I had known them, no one tried to stop me from walking out. 6 months later, the lake house still stood exactly where it always had. Same view, same long driveway, same quiet stretch of water that looked calm even when it wasn't. But everything about it had changed. Not physically, structurally. The trust had been finalized without complication. Michael handled the filing, and once it went through, the ownership stopped being personal. It became governed by terms, by limits, by intent that couldn't be rewritten in private conversations. No one controlled it anymore. And that was the point. I went back once. Not for a holiday, not for a family gathering. Just to see it. I walked through the front door without anyone opening it for me. The air inside felt the same, familiar but not welcoming. Just neutral. There were no framed photos of recent events, no signs that anyone had tried to reclaim it emotionally. It wasn't a symbol anymore. Just a place. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Same layout, same counters, same space where I had spent hours trying to earn something that was never really being offered. I didn't feel anger. That surprised me. I didn't feel satisfaction either. Just distance. The kind that comes when something no longer has the ability to define you. I left without staying long. There was nothing there I needed to take with me. The divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier. Quietly. No drawn-out conflict. No public arguments. Daniel didn't fight it. He didn't contest anything. When we signed the final papers, he looked at me like he wanted to say something more than what the moment allowed. "I'm sorry," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even unexpected. But it was late. I know, I replied. And I did. That was the part people misunderstand. Acknowledging someone's regret doesn't mean you undo what happened. It just means you see it clearly. We didn't leave as enemies, but we didn't leave with anything to rebuild either. Some things don't break all at once. They erode. And by the time you notice there's nothing solid left to stand on, I moved into a smaller apartment closer to the city. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Fewer rooms, less space to fill with expectations that didn't belong to me. Work stayed the same. If anything, I leaned into it more. Not as a distraction, but as something that had always been mine, even when I had tried to minimize it for the sake of being easier to accept. Michael and I still met occasionally, not always about legal matters, sometimes just for coffee. "You handled it exactly the way it needed to be handled," he told me once. I shook my head. "I handled it the way I could live with," I said. That mattered more. Because there were moments early on where I could have pushed harder, taken more. Forced outcomes that would have looked like a win from the outside. But that wasn't what I wanted. Control had already taken enough from that family. I wasn't interested in replacing it with my own version of the same thing. The trust did what it was supposed to do. It removed leverage. It created boundaries that didn't depend on who was speaking the loudest. and it made sure that whatever happened to that house next would happen under terms no one could quietly rewrite. I heard through indirect conversations that Eleanor had stepped back from managing most family decisions, not voluntarily, but necessarily. Charles adjusted. He always did. Vanessa moved on quickly, new priorities, new narratives. And Daniel, I didn't keep track. Not out of resentment, out of clarity. There are relationships that change form, and there are relationships that end. Knowing the difference is part of healing. The last time I thought about Margaret Whitman's letter, I wasn't reading it. I was remembering one line. If you choose to stay, do it with boundaries they cannot ignore. I had chosen not to stay, but the boundaries remained. Not for them, for me. And that was enough. Sometimes the hardest part of being underestimated isn't proving people wrong. It's recognizing how much of yourself you've adjusted just to avoid conflict. If you've ever found yourself shrinking to fit into a family, a relationship, or a role that never truly included you, I hope this story reminds you that boundaries are not punishment, they're clarity. You don't need to take everything to reclaim your space. You don't need to win in the way others define it. And forgiveness, if you choose, it doesn't mean reopening the door to the same behavior that hurt you. It just means you're no longer carrying it. If you've experienced something like this where silence was expected and speaking up felt like breaking something, feel free to share your perspective. I read more than you think, and if stories like this resonate with you, you can follow along. There's more to explore and more conversations worth having. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.